Someday I'm going to get organized and actually get this so that the slideshow is ready to start when the recording starts. But so far I'm not there. So we're going to look at carbon and organic functional groups. So the goal is that you watch the screencast tonight so that tomorrow you can come to class and I can work with the small groups that need help. This is always more challenging to do first semester because nobody's taken grade 12 chemistry. But you need to be comfortable with the functional groups that are present in biological molecules in order to understand their properties and how they react. So why do we need to understand carbon or organic chemistry in a biology class? What we want to be able to do is describe and compare these biologically important molecules. And the basic building block of all biologically important molecules is carbon. So we have to understand A, the carbon atom itself, and then B, the types of carbon-containing compounds that are out there before we can begin. So carbon can form millions of different compounds because it's got 4 unpaired electrons in its valence shell. So because it's got those 4 unpaired electrons, it can bond with one thing, it can bond with 2 things, it can bond with 3 things. There's a great deal of variety. So because it has all these different options open to it, we end up with millions and millions of different carbon-containing compounds. And because those millions and millions of different carbon-containing compounds can react in millions and millions and millions of different ways, scientists looked for commonalities that would dictate how those things reacted so they could help them study the molecules better and understand and predict the reactions better. So what they started to look for are reactive sites on the molecules, areas that are going to determine the physical and chemical properties of those molecules. And they called those things, you can see here's a group here, here's a group here. They called those groups that were common functional groups. So when we name carbon-containing compounds, we name them using prefixes and suffixes. So similar to how you learned to name covalent compounds in grade 9 and grade 10. But in this case, we use roots to determine the number of carbon atoms present and suffixes to tell us the types of bonds or groups that are present. So the roots that you're going to use are meth, indicating 1 carbon atom, eth indicating 2, prop indicating 3, bute indicates 4, pent indicates 5, hex indicates 6, hept indicates 7, oct indicates 8, and so on. So if you were talking about octane at a gas station, that has 8 carbon atoms in it. Methane, that's what's in our gas jets, has 1 carbon atom in it. Butane, that's in your lighters, has 4. Propane, that's in your barbecue, has 3. So when we name an organic compound, the first thing we do is we look for its longest carbon chain, and that's what's going to determine the prefix that it starts with. So you can see here, I have this molecule, and I look and say, okay, I could have a chain that looks like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can have a chain that looks like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All of them have 6, so the easiest thing to do is just kind of pick the straightest option. And then I'm going to look at the type of bonds that are present. In this case, each of my carbon atoms is singly bonded to either another carbon atom or to 1 or more hydrogen atoms. So here, this carbon's bonded to 3 other hydrogens. This carbon's bonded to 3 carbons and 1 hydrogen. But it looks to me like there's only single bonds present. So because there's only single bonds present, that determines my suffix. And in this case, the suffix is an ane ending. So this molecule would be hexane. Now you'll note that hexane is that longest continuous chain, but there are some other carbons branching off that, so we also name the branches. This is got a 2 carbon group, so we call that an ethyl group because the prefix is eth. This has a 1 carbon group because the prefix is meth. So this would end up being ethyl methyl hexane. And we also have to say the numbers. So in this case, it's 3 ethyl, 2 methyl, because the ethyl is on carbon 3, 1, 2, 3, and the methyl is on carbon 2. I'm not going to ask you to do any organic naming, but I just want you to have this in the back of your head so when we start talking about organic compounds, you have some sense of where that name comes from. There's different ways we can depict hydrocarbons. This is an expanded formula. Typically, when I draw a hydrocarbon, I'll use the expanded formula. The only thing I'll skip are these H's. So I'm not going to draw every H out. It doesn't look badly when it's done by a computer, but even me, now maybe it's because it's late at night when I'm recording this, but it makes me look a bit cross-eyed looking at it. So I tend to skip the H's and just draw the sticks, and it's fine if you do that too. This is a condensed formula, so it shows the carbons and the hydrogens, but I find sometimes when students use this, they forget that they have to count that hydrogen as a bond. We can also represent this using a ball and stick model or a space filling model. So the ball and stick model kind of represents where the nuclei for each of the atoms would be. The space filling model tries to show you better where all the electrons are. And we tend to use structural formulas fairly often when we're talking about organic compounds because unlike a molecular formula, they show us the orientation and what's bonded to what. And that's important because many organic compounds are what we call structural isomers. So they'll have the same molecular formula, but they'll have a different structural formula. And because they have a different structural formula, they're going to have completely different properties, which is hugely important when we start talking about the enzymes that break them down. So a single line between two atoms indicates that you have a single covalent bond. A double line indicates a double covalent bond. And a triple line indicates a triple covalent bond. So if this is sounding completely foreign, it probably means you didn't take grade 11 chemistry. And that's not a big deal. It just means that tomorrow in class, I'm going to spend some more time focusing with those small groups of students who haven't taken grade 11 chem. So I mentioned before the idea of a structural isomer. A structural isomer is something that has the same molecular formula, but looks different because the atoms are arranged differently around those central carbon atoms. Now, I mentioned the term functional group. When we talk about carbon-containing compounds, they're huge. There's millions of them, and they can be all sorts of different sizes. They can be all sorts of different shapes, but we need some way to predict how they're going to react. So in order to do that, we look at the groups on the molecule that are actually quite reactive. So if you think about methane, butane, propane, and octane, which are the hydrocarbons that you're probably most familiar with, we don't really think about them in any other context other than burning. So basic hydrocarbons with nothing else on them really aren't all that reactive except with oxygen. So they burn quite nicely. It's the introduction of other atoms like oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus that really change those properties and make them more reactive. And because it's those oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus atoms that make them reactive, we call those functional groups because adding them changes the function, changes the properties of that particular molecule. They're also important because they participate in hydrogen bonding, so that's going to determine whether they interact with water, dissolve in water, or whether they're repelled by water. So the important functional groups that you will be responsible for knowing in this course are alkenes, and you'll know something is an alkene if it has an ene suffix, an ene ending. Alkynes will have a yne ending. Alcohols have an ol ending. So think, the example they give you here is methanol or methyl alcohol. Methyl alcohol is in, I want to say windshield washer fluid, and I think maybe a little bit in antifreeze. Ethanol, so the 2-carbon alcohol, is what's in wine and beer and alcohols we think of. So if you ever, as a kid, wondered why your parents drank alcohol and didn't seem to have any problems, but you used rubbing alcohol on your cuts and you definitely couldn't drink that, that's because alcohol is really a general name applied to a whole huge class of models. Or molecules, sorry. Haloalkanes are shown here. So they're just a hydrocarbon with a halogen. So chlorine, fluorine, iodine, bromine bonded to them. These are not really biologically important at all, so you won't be responsible for knowing those. In fact, they tend to be quite unpleasant in biological systems in most cases. Amines you will be responsible for knowing. Amines involved a nitrogen bonded to two hydrogens. So here, this is an amine or an amino group. This is ethylamine. An aldehyde, and we're gonna just to go back to amines, we're gonna talk about amino acids, and one of the functional groups on amino acids is this amine group. Aldehydes and you'll see on the next slide, ketones are part of the same functional group, which is a carbonyl group. So if you look, this is my carbonyl group, the C double bond O. All right. So a C double bond O is a carbonyl group. And in this case, my C double bond O is at the end of the molecule. So the C is bonded to one carbon and one hydrogen. Because this C is at the end of a molecule bonded to a carbon and a hydrogen, we call it an aldehyde. So aldehydes are at the end of a molecule. If that carbonyl group, that C double bond O, is in the middle of a molecule, so here the carbon with the C double bond O is attached to two other carbons, it's in the middle of a three-carbon molecule, that's what we call a ketone. So both aldehydes and ketones are biologically important. They are an important part of carbohydrates, and we all know what carbs are in general. This is acetone. So think of the smell of nail polish remover. It doesn't tend to contain acetone as much anymore. You can buy acetone-free nail polish remover, but that's definitely the smell that you get off acetone. It's often used in cleaning glassware and things like that, and it's a characteristic smell that if you know anybody who's on a super low-carb diet, they tend to actually have a bit of an acetone smell, because if they're on a really low-carb diet, they start breaking food down, and one of the byproducts is ketones. They go through a process called ketogenesis. So they end up with a bit of an acetone-y smell. You'll smell it on their breath and even in their sweat. Carboxylic acids are another extremely important functional group. So you can see here, this is the actual acid functional group. It's that C double bond O that was in an aldehyde, but that same carbon also has an alcohol, an OH group bonded to it. So it's got a C double bond O OH, all on the same carbon. And an example would be ethanoic acid. That's acetic acid or vinegar. Esters, amides are really more important in the context of bonds forming. So we're not going to look at a lot of biologically important molecules that start out as esters and amides. But what we'll find is when two functional groups react in biologically important molecules, they tend to form either one of these groups. So an ester is formed, for example, when a carboxylic acid and an alcohol meet and combine. That's going to happen in lipids and fats. And here we can see an amide. An amide is a type of bond that occurs when a carboxylic acid and an amino group bump into each other. And this is actually the backbone bond of most proteins. Nitriles you don't need to worry about. The thing that we're missing in here is a sulfhydryl group and a phosphate group. So the sulfhydryl group is an SH bonded to a carbon, and the phosphate group is a PO4 molecule bonded to a carbon. And we'll really spend more time with those when we get into the specific biologically important molecules later in the week. So some molecules we know of that have an alcohol functional group that are biologically important. Cholesterol is a major sterol in plants. So sterols tend to be hormones. Cholesterol we're also going to talk about as being important in the cell membrane, and it's the basis of many steroid hormones as well. So things like estrogen, progesterone, testosterone are all based off this sterol or cholesterol background. And you can see here's my alcohol group here. Serine is an amino acid found in protein. So I said the amino acid group was going to become important later on. So here's my amino group. Here's my carboxylic acid group. That's where aminos get their name. But down here, serine, this particular amino acid has an OH group as part of it. Methanol or alcohol So as I said, it's a de-icing agent. It's found in antifreeze. It can be used as a gasoline substitute, although it's not really very common. We tend to substitute ethanol more commonly. And then ethane-adiol, or ethylene glycol, that is the major component of auto antifreeze. It's also extremely toxic. It's why you never bring anything anywhere you're going to drink in an antifreeze bottle. There's actually a New Year's party that ended very tragically in, I want to say, a town outside London, where somebody brought punch to a party in an antifreeze jug, and 2 people, I think, from the party ended up dead, and an assortment were also in the hospital. And it was just that little bit of ethylene that had clung to the plastic was enough to make people really sick and kill people. So you can see it's called ethane-adiol. The di means 2, so it's actually got 2 alcohol groups in it. Amine functional groups. Here you can see them, an NH2, there's my amine. So a nitrogen bonded to a carbon and 2 other hydrogens. This molecule is lysine, another amino acid. Adenine is an important component of nucleic acids. It's one of the 4 nitrogenous bases. Epinephrine is a hormone. So it's a neurotransmitter in the brain and a hormone. It's also known as adrenaline. So this is the drug that's released in a time of stress. And you can see here, here's my amine group in epinephrine. It actually has one of its hydrogens removed and substituted with another carbon. And cocaine, brain stimulant, dopamine substitute, widely abused drug. Actually also an analgesic. So it used to be used in eye surgery. Up until I think the 1980s, if you went in for eye surgery, they would use cocaine as the anesthetic in your eye. Aldehydes and ketones. So here, again, it's characterized by the C double bond O. This C double bond O has an H bonded to it. It's at the end of a molecule. It's methanol, more commonly known as formaldehyde. So it's used for the resins in plywood, so the stuff that holds the chipboard and plywood together. It's in some dishware, although not so much anymore because it's highly toxic. Countertops, so it's in melamine. If you've got a melamine countertop, it's used in the process to make the melamine countertop, and then as a biologically preservative. So it used to be that when you'd buy preserved specimens, they were preserved in formaldehyde. Formaldehyde, however, is carcinogenic, so now they're come packaged in formalin, which has a small amount of formaldehyde in it, but not as much. We actually have started buying formaldehyde-free specimens just because that way our pregnant teachers can still dissect things. Ethanol, or acetaldehyde, it's a narcotic product of ethanol metabolism. So when your parents, who are old enough to legally consume alcohol, drink, it's thought that this acetaldehyde is actually part of what's responsible for your hangover symptoms, and why part of why consuming any extra language, darling. Part of why consuming any water is thought to help. So alcohol is, we'll learn later on, dehydrates you, but the extra water can actually help to, or the extra water can actually help to flush this acetaldehyde out of your liver. It's also in perfume, some artificial flavoring, plastics, and other chemicals. Benzaldehyde is what's in artificial almond extract. And acetone, as I mentioned before, it's a nail polish remover, so it's a common solvent for lots of inorganic compounds, lots of non-water soluble compounds. So fat, rubber, plastic, varnish, lacquers of all course, and butanone or methyl ethyl ketone is another solvent. Carboxylic acid functional groups that are important. Methanoic acid or formic acid is what's in ant and bee stings that cause them to hurt. Butyric acid, because this is biologically important. Here's my carboxylic acid group, so my C double bond OH. Butyric acid is the smell of a rancid butter or a monkey sex attractant. So there you go. Don't go near monkeys with rancid butter. Benzoic acid is used as a calorimetric standard. It's also a food preservative and a fabric dye, and it's used in the process of tobacco curing. Stearic acid is found in butter, and it's also common in making candles and soap. Anything that's based out of animal fat. And that's that. Where am I going? Pause, 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 stop.